Yes, we are live. Hi, welcome back to this is actually our third series that Violetta Zane has put together with Firm Foundation and through the sponsorship of the Desert Rose Baha'i Institute. So this one is The Extraordinary Life of Abdu'l-Bahá. And if you would like to take a look at the series prior to this, which was The Primal Point and The Blessed Beauty, all incredible series. You can find those on the Clearwater Baha'i's website. They're all listed down there. You can find them on the Clearwater Baha'i's YouTube page and the Facebook. And we are uploading those to the Desert Rose Baha'i Institute as well. And eventually they'll be made public on the Firm Foundation Academy's social media as well. So Violetta, is there any other introductions or specifics that you'd like to discuss?
I would like to say two things before we start. The first thing is that this series was the idea and the brainchild of Peter Terry. I remember a couple of years ago when I first published my first chronology, my father asked me if we could make a movie of it, and I said no. And then Peter Terry came up in March or May of last year and said, I want to do something different with Baha'i history. I want you to narrate these chronologies. And I said yes, without thinking what the logistics would be, given that the chronologies are between, this one is 500 pages long, Bahá'u'llah's was 400 pages long, and the Bab's was 300 pages long. So it's safe to say that over the last 2 months, when we've done the chronology of the life of the Bab first and then Bahá'u'lláh, these chronologies have had an impact on people because of two very important factors. One is that they're sort of like audiobooks, and audiobooks are very popular. So narrating a chronology is sort of like an audiobook, but this has two important differences with an audiobook. Is one, there is a visual component. Is that once in a while you can look at images of people we're talking about, not the central figures except for Abdu'l-Bahá, but maps also, and important believers like apostles of Baha'u'llah. And the other important component is you, because people who record audiobooks are in a studio, and I'm recording this and I'm looking at you. Whether you have your video on or off, it doesn't matter, because even if your video is off, I can see your names. And so this has a community component, an emotional component above and beyond what an audiobook has. And I want to thank you for being here, because you make all the difference, because I'm speaking to you when I read. I can see your faces. And the other thing I wanted to say is this chronology is quite different from the other two chronologies because it's written in the present tense. I did that on purpose because this chronology was released part by part, leading up to the ascension, the 100-year commemoration of the ascension of Abdu'l-Bahá in 1921. And so this is in fact the very first chronology I ever wrote. So I wrote them in reverse order. I wrote first the one of Abdu'l-Bahá, then the one of Bahá'u'lláh, then the one of the Bab. And so it might take a little bit for you to get used to me speaking in the present tense about past events, but here we go. I'm going to share my screen now. Okay. The Extraordinary Life of Abdu'l-Bahá, Part 1, The Four Exiles, 1844 to 1868. And this is a portrait of Abdu'l-Bahá taken in Paris, France, in October 1911. On the occasion of the ascension, the centenary of the ascension of Abdu'l-Bahá, I created two PDFs, one in French and one in English, very summarized versions of this entire chronology that people can use to present to their local communities. So if you go to the first page, which you will receive in the email I send you tonight, you can download the English or the French one or both. And as usual, for those of you who've been with us, you know that my father, Kamal Zain, and is really my pillar in all the work that I do. And he often comes to me with quotes. At the beginning of my work on a very large chronology, he comes to me with quotes that direct the span, scope, and spirit of my work. And these are the two quotes that my father gave me, which I put at the very top of the chronology, and I'm going to read them for you. There has branched from the Sudratul Muntaha this sacred and glorious being, this branch of holiness. Well is it with him that hath sought his shelter and abideth beneath his shadow. Verily, the limb of the law of God hath sprung forth from this root, which God hath firmly implanted in the ground of his will, and whose branch hath been so uplifted as to encompass the whole of creation. Magnified be he, therefore, for this sublime, this blessed, this mighty, this exalted handiwork. Draw nigh unto him, O people, and taste of the fruits of wisdom and knowledge that have proceeded from him, who is the Almighty, the All-Knowing. This is from Bahá'u'lláh, the Suri Ghusn, the tablet of the branch. And just look at the words. He's speaking of his own son, who is to be the center of the covenant. This is in 1868, 1870, when he was in Edirne. And he speaks of him like he's a work of art. This sublime, this blessed, this mighty, this exalted handiwork. He's speaking of Abdu'l-Bahá like a work of art. He is speaking of Abdu'l-Bahá as a sacred and glorious being, his own son. He is the supreme manifestation of God. And this is 25, 28 years before he passes away. And already the intimations that Abdu'l-Bahá will be the center of the covenant. The second quote is from Abdu'l-Bahá. It's very well known, but I'm going to read it anyway. My name is Abdu'l-Bahá, the servant of Bahá. My identity is Abdu'l-Bahá. My qualification is Abdu'l-Bahá. My reality is Abdu'l-Bahá. My praise is Abdu'l-Bahá. Thraldom to the blessed perfection is my glorious and refulgent diadem. Servitude to all the human race is my perpetual religion. Through the bounty and favor of the blessed perfection, Baha'u'lláh, Abdu'l-Bahá is the ensign of the most great peace, which is waving from the supreme apex. And through the gift of the greatest name, he is the lamp of universal salvation, which is shining with the light of the love of God. The herald of the kingdom is he, so that he may awaken the people of the east and of the west. The voice of friendship, uprightness, truth, and reconciliation is he, so as to cause acceleration throughout all the regions. No name, no title, no mention, no commendation hath he, nor will he ever have, except Abdu'l-Bahá. This is my longing. This is my supreme apex. This is my greatest yearning. This is my eternal life. This is my everlasting glory. So you see how Abdu'l-Bahá speaks of himself and how Baha'u'lláh speaks of him. I think I need to extend sharing a little bit so you can see the edges of the quotes. There you go. And you know, the shrine of Abdu'l-Bahá is not a vertical shrine. It's not a shrine you can see from far away. It's invisible. It's underground almost. From a distance, you can't see it. And when you get right up to the door, the very small door, and the large entrance that looks like a cathedral of white stone. It seems unbearably glorious, but yet from a distance you can't see it. Partly because of this. My name is Abdu'l-Bahá. That's all he is, the servant of Bahá. So the architects who created his shrine were supremely inspired. This part one, the four exiles, covers the life of Abdu'l-Bahá from his birth in 1844 to the age of 24 years old in 1868. And we begin at the beginning. That same night, Shiraz and Tehran. 23rd of May, 1844, Shiraz, the birth of the Babi faith. This is a photograph of the room in the house of the Bab where the Bab declared his mission in Shiraz, Iran, before it was destroyed in 1979. 2 hours after sunset in Shiraz, a young merchant named Sayyid Ali Muhammad announces to Mullah Hussein that he is the bearer of a message destined to transform the life of humanity. He is the Bab, and this is the night of his declaration. O thou who art the first to believe in me, verily I say, I am the Bab, the gate of God. These are the words of the Bab in the Dawnbreakers. On the 23rd of May, 1844, that very same night in Tehran, the birth of Abdu'l-Bahá. This is Tehran, Iran, where Abdu'l-Bahá was born, a photograph taken in the 1930s. Approximately 6 hours after the declaration of the Bab, at midnight, almost 1,000 kilometers away in Tehran, Mirza Hussein Ali, later known as Bahá'u'lláh, the glory of God, and his wife, Asiye Khanum, welcomed their third child, the only one to live from the first one to survive infancy, a boy whom they name Abbas after his grandfather. Abbas meaning lion. Abdu'l-Bahá, the servant of Bahá, the servant of Baha'u'llah, and perfect exemplar of the teachings of the faith, is born on the very same night as the Babi faith and the Baha'i dispensation. Baha'u'llah will bestow many titles on Abdu'l-Bahá relating to his unique station, among which the master, Sarkar Agha, the most great branch, Ghusni Azam, the center of the covenant, Markazi Mithak, and the mystery of God, Sirullah. The very next day, the 24th of May, 1844, what hath God wrought? This is a copy of the first telegraphic message sent by Samuel Morse on the 24th of May, 1844, with Morse code above the first word, above each letter. Almost exactly 24 hours later, and 10,000 kilometers away from these twin events on the 23rd of May, 1844, which are some of the most wondrous moments in human history. Human history is about to experience a turning point. Samuel Morse is in Washington, D.C., and sends the first telegraphic message to Baltimore, nearly 70 kilometers away. And the content of this message is spiritual. What hath God wrought? ? Two women inspired this iconic verse to Samuel Morse, and the story is very well told in an 1891 article called The First Telegraph Message and Its Author. Miss Ellsworth now gave Morse the message suggested by her mother, what hath God wrought? And that wonderfully apt sentence, a genuine inspiration, was sent in triplicate to Baltimore. It was the first message ever transmitted by a recording telegraph. So sometime after the birth of Abdu'l-Bahá, in late spring, early summer, 1844, the story of the scroll. On a mission entrusted to him by the Bab himself, Mullah Hussein delivers to Baha'u'llah through an intermediary a scroll wrapped in a piece of cloth. After Baha'u'llah reads one page of the scroll, he turns to his younger brother Mirza Musa, his faithful brother, and says, "Musa, what have you to say?" "Verily, I say, whoso believes in the Quran and recognizes its divine origin, and yet hesitates, though it be for a moment, to admit that these soul-stirring words are endowed with the same regenerating power, has most assuredly erred in his judgment and has strayed far from the path of justice. Baha'u'llah's acceptance of the claim of the Bab is instantaneous and complete. Between 1844 and 1852, Baha'u'llah's life is devoted to his new faith. Mazandaran and Tehran. Between 1844 and 1853, an idyllic childhood between Tehran and Mazandaran. On the left, you have the house of Baha'u'llah in Takur, Mazandaran. And then on the right is a photograph of a house Abdu'l-Bahá never lived in. This is the house his father was born in, the Baha'u'llah was born in, and was the house of his grandfather. Abdu'l-Bahá, Baha'u'llah, Asiya Khanum, and then his younger siblings all lived in a rented house near the gate of Shimran, and we have no photographs of this house. Abdu'l-Bahá spent his first years in an environment of privilege, wealth, and immense love. The family's Tehran home and country houses in Mazandaran are comfortable and beautifully decorated. Abdu'l-Bahá and his younger full siblings, a sister Bahiye and a brother Mirza Mehdi, have every advantage in their station in life can offer. Abdu'l-Bahā's childhood is shaped by the fact that his father, Baha'u'llah, is a prominent Babi, and he is a witness to great moments in the history of the faith. As a child in his home in Tehran, he is seated on the lap of Tahireh when in the course of her memorable interview with the celebrated Vahid, she interrupts Vahid's learned discourse on the signs of a new manifestation, and she vehemently urges Vahid to arise and demonstrate the depth and sincerity of his faith through deeds of heroism and self-sacrifice. Though never formally schooled, Abdu'l-Bahá receives most of his education from his family, and most particularly his father Baha'u'llah. He has a happy and carefree early childhood and is extremely close to his younger siblings. Sometime between 1847 and 1852, the story of the sheep and the country barbecue. This is a view of Takur, Mazandaran in the north of Iran, where the family of Baha'u'llah had a house. In Mazandaran, when Abdu'l-Bahá is a child old enough to ride a horse, Agha Rahim, the overseer of Baha'u'llah's shepherds, and a flock of 4,000 sheep and goats, takes Abdu'l-Bahá to a country barbecue. 80 or so shepherds, dressed in their finest, come to meet the young Abdu'l-Bahá. After the feast, the shepherds approach Abdu'l-Bahá and hint that a gift from him is customary to the landlords in these parts. Faced with a dilemma, having brought nothing with him, Abdu'l-Bahá thinks for a few moments, and the idea comes to him to give each shepherd a few sheep from the family's own flocks. The overseer is rather pleased with this gift, and he is immediately acted upon. Reaching the family home, Abdu'l-Bahá's act of generosity is relayed to Baha'u'llah. And as Abdu'l-Bahá himself recalls in Star of the West, volume 15, Baha'u'llah laughed very much over it and said to Agha Rahim, "We must appoint a guardian to protect Agha, the master, from his own liberality, else someday he may give himself away." These prophetic words from the Blessed Beauty perfectly describe the next 7 decades of Abdu'l-Bahā's life. He will give his life away, drop by drop, to the world and its people. Now I have an exciting story to share with you that was shared with me by a historian, Ismael Velasco. November 1851, Abdu'l-Bahā's mission to the Amir Nizam. The Amir Nizam, of course, is this man seated with the curved sword in the middle of the picture and all these decorations on his breast. His name is also Mirza Taqi Khan, and this is his military uniform. Baha'u'lláh was on pilgrimage in Karbala for 8 months between 1851 and 1852, shortly after the martyrdom of the Bab and the very bloody massacres in Mazandaran, Neyriz, and Zanjan, as well as the 7 martyrs of Tehran and the martyrdom of the Bab. Thousands of Bahá'ís lost their lives, and the prime minister at the time recommended, quote unquote, that Baha'u'lláh, the most prominent Babi in Iran, leave for some period of time. So Baha'u'lláh left for Karbala, something many people did from Iran because in Karbala, Iraq, is one of those holy cities where 6 of the 11 imams of Shia Islam are buried in Iraq. And so it was common for people to go to Iraq for a period of time to pilgrimage to the holy shrines. So ostensibly, this is what Baha'u'lláh was doing for these 8 months, but he was also proclaiming the Babi faith. So during this time, we don't exactly know when, Baha'u'lláh sent Abdu'l-Bahá, then a child of only 7.5 years old, on a critical mission to deliver a sensitive message to Mirza Taqi Khan, the Amir Nizam, general of the Persian army, 50 kilometers from Tehran. Nothing is known about this confidential mission and the urgent circumstances surrounding the event, but it is without doubt that Abdul Wahab Bey, the servant from Baha'u'llah's child household, entrusted to accompany the young Abdu'l-Bahá on this mission, had strict instructions to bring Abdu'l-Bahá back home without delay. Remember, Baha'u'lláh already knows that Abdu'l-Bahá is going to be the center of the covenant, so he is to be protected at all costs, yet he is sent on a dangerous mission. So one day in early winter, Abdul Wahab Bey mounts his horse and lifts Abdu'l-Bahá up before him on the saddle. The 50 kilometers separating them from the army are covered at great speed and without stopping once for rest or refreshment. Once at the garrison, Abdu'l-Bahá is immediately brought before Mustaful Mamalik, who shows him great respects and consideration, and then introduces him to the Amir Nizam, the general of the army, Mirza Taqi Khan, who inquires as to the nature of Abdu'l-Bahā's mission. Abdu'l-Bahá then conveys the message of Baha'u'lláh. The general listens attentively, weighing the words of Abdu'l-Bahá, then issues orders based on the information that had just been conveyed to him. The Amir Nizam invites Abdu'l-Bahá to remain in the camp overnight and return to Tehran in the morning sufficiently rested and refreshed. It is at this point Abdul Wahab Bey, the servant, whisks Abdu'l-Bahá back to Tehran the very same day, covering another 50 kilometers in the freezing winter without resting. Abdu'l-Bahá remembered the event very clearly, as he would tell Mirza Ahmad Sohrab in 1913 when he was in Haifa. Abdul Wahab Bey, these are the reported words of Abdu'l-Bahá. Abdul Wahab Bey, however, hearing of the successful conference with the general and wishing the good news to reach my family as soon as possible, resorted to a stratagem to leave the garrison at once. Knowing my love for nature and the country, he came to me and said, "Little master, I know a lovely village not very far away. Why should you remain in this smoky camp? Let us go to this hamlet. It has many lovely gardens, fruit trees and flowers, and the climate is exhilarating. in the extreme. The young child, in front of such enthusiasm for what seemed like an extraordinary place, yields to Abdul-Wahhab, who scoops Abdul-Bahá up again in front of the saddle, then proceeds to lash the horse mercilessly towards Tehran. Abdul-Bahá asks Abdul-Wahhab once in a while about the hamlet, with no answer. After hours and hours of racing, Abdul-Bahá sees the familiar skyline of Tehran, but is too tired to protest about having missed that heavenly village. Upon arrival, Abdul-Bahá is carried into the house, asleep and numbed by the cold. He is laid to rest near the fireplace until the circulation in his limbs is restored. The mission took a grave toll on Abdul-Bahá, as he himself states. That night and the following day, I could eat nothing. And for more than 2 weeks, I was like a child whose sensitive organs and bones had been crushed to pieces. This is the first time in his life we almost lose Abdul-Bahá. He almost died at the age of 7.5. And he contracted pneumonia from this episode also. 15th of August, 1852, the attempt on Nasruddin Shah's life. This is Nasruddin Shah. On August 15th, 1852, 3 young Babis, distraught by the execution of the Bab 2 years earlier and unable to make their peace with it, make an ill-conceived and failed attempt on the life of the Shah. Reprisals begin quickly against the Babis. Shortly after August 15th, 1852, Baha'u'lláh is arrested and his homes are sacked. This is the village of Afchi near Tehran. Baha'u'lláh is in Afchi, having just returned from his 8 months in Iraq when the attempted assassination takes place. The event causes an uproar throughout Tehran, where Asiye Khanum is alone with Abdul-Bahá aged 8, Bahiye Khanum aged 6, and Mirza Mehdi still a baby. All Babis are hunted down and arrested, and a mob sacks Baha'u'llah's home, stripping it of its furnishings. Asiye Khanum initially seeks shelter with an aunt, married to a government official, but seeing their alarm at her presence and that of her children, and not wanting to put them in danger, she returns home. Shortly after August 15th, 1852, Baha'u'lláh is bastinadoed and chained in the streets. This is the torture of the bastinado, where the feet are tied to a rod and the soles exposed, and they are beaten with a thin cane until they bleed. It is a form of torture that is exclusively designed to cause the most amount of pain without killing. It's very, very cruel, and it was very popular in Iran. Nawab hears what has happened to Baha'u'lláh from a distressed servant who saw him in the streets. And he comes running into the house and says, the master, he is arrested. I've seen him. He was walked many, many miles. Oh, they have beaten him. They say he has suffered the torture of the bastinado. His feet are bleeding. He has no shoes on. His turban is gone. His clothes are torn. There are chains upon his neck. Shortly after this, and also sometime between August and December, but probably closer to August, Abdul-Bahá is surrounded by a mob. This is a photograph of the entrance of the Siat Chal, Persian words which mean black pit, which used to be a reservoir for a bathhouse in Tehran, but were now converted into a prison. And they were very, very humid and icy cold because of the fact that they were a reservoir. They were initially conceived as reservoirs. Abdul-Bahá tells a story of being surrounded by a mob. One day, and this is in the Dawnbreakers, one day I happened to be walking alone through the market on my way to my uncle's house. As I was looking behind me, I found a band of little ruffians running fast to overtake me. They were pelting me with stones and shouting menacingly, "Babi, Babi!" To intimidate them seemed the only way I could avert the danger with which I was threatened. I turned back and rushed towards them with such determination that they fled away in distress and vanished. I could hear their distant cry, "The little Babi is frost pursuing us. He will surely overtake us and slay us all." As I was directing my steps home, I heard a man shouting at the top of his voice, "Well done, you brave and fearless child. No one your age would ever have been able, unaided, to withstand their attack." From that day onward, I was never again molested by any of the boys on the street, nor did I hear any offensive word fall from their lips. Mirza Musa, Baha'u'llah's brother, helped Asiya Khanum and the children escape into hiding. The garments of Asiya Khanum's clothes were of gold, and Asiya Khanum managed to sell some of these in order to pay the prison guards and allow her to bring Baha'u'llah some food, as well as other expenses. The Holy Family now lived in a small house not far from the Siat Chal for the next 4 months. Sometime in August 1852, Abdu'l-Bahá visits Baha'u'llah in the Siat Chal. This is a photograph of the entrance of the Siat Chal, chosen specifically for this vignette because the story involves the first few steps down into the pit. Abdu'l-Bahá was extremely attached to his father, and separation from him was unbearable. And he was insistent on seeing Baha'u'llah. And so the 8-year-old Abdu'l-Bahá goes to the Siat Chal. He is carried on the shoulders of a servant along a narrow corridor, through a small doorway, and down 2 steps. He describes the abominable, inhumane dungeon reserved for Iran's most hardened criminals. I saw a dark, steep place. We entered a small, narrow doorway, and I went down 2 steps. But beyond those, one could see nothing. In the middle of the stairway, all of a sudden, we heard Baha'u'llah's voice, "Do not bring him in here." And so they took me back. We sat outside, waiting for the prisoners to be led out. Suddenly, they brought out the Blessed Perfection, Baha'u'llah, out of the dungeon. He was chained to several others. What a chain! It was very heavy. The prisoners could only move along it with very great difficulty. Sad and heartrending it was. At some point after this, Abdu'l-Bahá had fainted and had to be carried out. Abdu'l-Bahá describes Baha'u'llah's chains. Here you have a photograph of Mirza Ali Muhammad Varagha in black on the left, and Ruhullah Varagha, his son, next to him, in heavy chains and fetters after being arrested. This is an illustration for the types of chains that would be around Baha'u'llah's neck, but Baha'u'llah's chains were probably 2, if not 3 times the size and weight of these. Abdu'l-Bahá further describes the conditions which Baha'u'llah was kept in vivid detail. A heavy chain was placed about his neck, by which he was chained to 5 other Babis. These fetters were locked together by strong, very heavy bolts and screws. His clothes were torn to pieces, also his headdress. In this terrible condition, he was kept for 4 months. In October 1852, Baha'u'llah received the revelation exactly between the 16th and the 27th of October, 1852. It is in the Siat Chal, this worst of all places, this dark, icy, humid reservoir, this black pit filled with fetid air, surrounded by the worst criminals of Iran, his feet in stocks and a mighty 50-kilogram chain weighing down his neck, that Baha'u'llah receives the revelation from God, disclosing to him that he is him whom God shall make manifest, the one promised by the Bab. 4 months later, well, 2 months after Baha'u'llah's revelation, but 4 months after entering the Siyachal, Baha'u'llah is released. This photograph is an homage to Maryam, the devoted and faithful cousin of Baha'u'llah, with whom he will be in touch for many years, and to whom he will write his most intimate tablets. This is the husband of Maryam, because we do not have a photograph of Maryam. The husband of Maryam and the half-brother of Baha'u'llah is named Mirza Reza Quli, this very handsome man you see here, with his beautiful Persian robe. He was a doctor. When Baha'u'llah is released from prison, he is stripped of all his possessions. His back is bent because of the weight of the fetters that weighed on him. His neck is swollen and injured, and his health is impaired. But Baha'u'llah tells no one about the revelation he received. Those closest to him, however, behold in him a transformation of spirit, a new power and radiance that they have never seen before. Baha'u'llah spends the month preceding his exile in the house of his half-brother, Mirza Reza Quli, a physician, this gentleman, and his wife Maryam, a cousin of Baha'u'llah and a faithful and sincere believer. With great care and affection, Maryam, together with Asiyeh Khanum, the wife of Baha'u'llah, nurse Baha'u'llah until his conditions improve enough for him to be exiled in the middle of winter. They don't nurse him back to health. They nurse him so that he can survive a 1,000-kilometer journey. There is a difference. This is what awaits Baha'u'llah. This is a map of the exile from Tehran to Baghdad and the journey of the approximate journey of the Holy Family, showing a few of their stops. The journey lasted 3 months, so they stopped at least 100 times. You only have 3 stops here on this journey, in this 1,000 kilometers. But one thing that's important to say is that the first exile of Baha'u'llah is different than the 3 others, because the first exile of Baha'u'llah followed the attempted assassination of the Shah by Bahá'ís. Baha'u'llah was the most prominent Baha'i of Persia. And when he was exiled, it was a fair exile. He wouldn't have been able to stay in Iran anyway, because probably someone would have wanted to kill him. So he was given the choice to go to Russia, because the prime minister of Russia really took a liking to Baha'u'llah. But Baha'u'llah chose Iraq, chose Baghdad. So those are the 2 aspects that make this exile very different from the others. It was a reasonable exile, and it was a place of Baha'u'llah's choosing. Istanbul, Edirne, and Akka were unfair exiles, unjust exiles, and very different from the first one. And so now, Baghdad. But first, the journey from Tehran to Baghdad, which lasted from mid-January to early April 1853. These are the Zagros Mountains, which Baha'u'llah, Asiyeh Khanum, Abdu'l-Bahá, and Bahiye Khanum, not Mirza Mihdi, crossed with their escort. And this photograph is a photograph of Jonah Lendering, and it's used with permission. Baha'u'llah, his wife, Asiyeh Khanum, who was several weeks pregnant with her 5th child, Abdul-Bahá, aged 8.5 years old, their daughter Bahiye Khanum, 7, and 2 of Baha'u'llah's brothers, Mirza Musa and Mirza Muhammad Quli, are exiled to Baghdad in the middle of a harsh winter. They are escorted by an officer of the Persian imperial bodyguard and an official representing the Russian legation, the last gift of the Russian ambassador, who said he would send an envoy all the way to the frontier with Iraq. Baha'u'llah and the Holy Family were thinly clad in summer clothes. And Abdul-Bahā's feet, ankle, and wrists were exposed to the bitter cold and froze. Abdul-Bahá felt tremendous pain from frostbite. And the Holy Family was grieving the separation from Mirza Mehdi, who was too young and too delicate to endure the journey. The family reaches Baghdad. In Bahiya Hanum's words later in her life, quote, in a state of great misery and also of almost utter destitution. They are unspeakably exhausted after 3 months, jostled on donkeys and freezing the entire time, and also hungry. Abdu'l-Bahá will never see his native land again. Sometime in 1853, Abdu'l-Bahá intuitively recognizes the station of Bahá'u'lláh. These are the words of Abdu'l-Bahá, overlaid over an aerial view of the neighborhood in Baghdad where they first lived, the old city of Baghdad. "10 years before Baha'u'lláh openly declares his mission, Abdu'l-Bahā's keen and superhuman insight at the age of 9 years old leads him to recognize intuitively that Baha'u'lláh is him whom God shall make manifest, the one promised by the Bab, that all Babis were awaiting. 60 years later, Abdu'l-Bahá remembers the very moment when this deep conviction overwhelmed him. And these are his reported words. I am the servant of the Blessed Perfection. In Baghdad, when I was a child, then and there he announced to me the word, and I believed in him. As soon as he proclaimed to me the word, I threw myself at his holy feet and implored and supplicated him. 9 years old. Just remember, he's 9 years old when this happens. I threw myself at his holy feet and implored and supplicated him to accept my blood as a sacrifice in his pathway. Sacrifice. How sweet I find that word. There is no greater bounty for me than this. What greater glory can I conceive than to see this neck chained for his sake, these feet fettered for his love, this body mutilated or thrown into the depths of the sea for his cause? If in reality we are his sincere lovers, if in reality I am his sincere servant, then I must sacrifice my life, my all at his blessed threshold. This is a very painful period of time for Abdu'l-Bahá. Between the 10th of April, 1854 and 19th of March, 1856, 2 full years, Baha'u'lláh retreats to Kurdistan. This is a view of the mountain of Sargalu in Sulaymaniyeh in Iraqi Kurdistan, where Baha'u'lláh lived for 1 year between 1854 and 1855, and the second year, Baha'u'lláh moved to the town of Sulaymaniyeh. Once Baha'u'lláh and the Holy Family arrived in Baghdad, nearly a year passed. After Baha'u'lláh had recovered from the aftermath of the Siyat Shal, he begins to teach, encourage, and exhort the Baha'is and the Babis around him. The machinations of Mirza Yahya and Sayyid Muhammad Isfahani, however, rise to such a point that when Abdu'l-Bahá is 10 years old, suddenly, and without informing a single member of his family, Baha'u'lláh vanishes on the 10th of April. The city of the mischief of Mirza Yahya and Sayyid Muhammad for the mountains of Iraqi Kurdistan, where he will remain for 2 years. Baha'u'lláh on Sargalu and in Sulaymaniyeh. Here, friends, we have a relic, one of the great bounties of this revelation and this dispensation is that we have real relics from the prophets of the manifestations of God of our dispensation. This is the actual kashkur, alms bowl, that Baha'u'lláh used as he traveled through the mountains of Sulaymaniyeh under the name Darwish Muhammad. His only companion, to whom Baha'u'lláh had given a sum of money, is murdered soon after they leave for Kurdistan. and Baha'u'llah is left entirely alone in his wanderings under the name Darvish Muhammad, attired in the garb of a traveler with coarse clothes, with his kashkul, alms bowl, and a change of clothes as his only possessions. The Blessed Beauty retires in utter solitude to a mountain named Sargalu, where he encounters other people only twice a year. During this period, Baha'u'llah reveals and composes in both Arabic and Persian and chants aloud. These are 2 profound years of contemplation and meditation for Baha'u'llah. Then after leaving the mountain and being invited to stay in town by a sheikh, Baha'u'llah arrives in Sulaymaniyeh. Excuse me. Baha'u'llah arrives in Sulaymaniyeh, and at first, Baha'u'llah is reserved and silent, and no one, because of his modesty, no one is aware of his greatness, of his superhuman knowledge and learning, of his oceanic capacity to reveal. But not long after arriving in Sulaymaniyeh, they see a sample of his exquisite calligraphy, and that betrays his knowledge, and they began asking questions. Baha'u'llah meets a number of sheikhs and wins their hearts. Baha'u'llah willingly answers abstruse questions of Sufi theology that they ask him, elucidates the most obscure passages that they can bring to him, and over the course of several interviews, reveals a 2,000-verse poem according to a specific meter and rhyme of the greatest mystical poem of all of Arabic literature. But he will only allow them to keep 127 verses of this poem. At the same time, between April 1854 and March 1856, Abdu'l-Bahá is very sorrowful. The sudden departure of his beloved father takes a heavy toll on Nabil, and that grief and loneliness had so consumed his soul that, in Abdu'l-Bahá's own words, in his boyhood, he had grown old. But at least he had Mirza Musa, and this is a short little vignette on Mirza Musa and Abdu'l-Bahá during the 2 years Baha'u'llah was in Sulaymaniyeh. This is the only photograph we have of Mirza Musa, Baha'u'llah's faithful brother, and Abdu'l-Bahá's beloved uncle. For 2 years, Abdu'l-Bahá is occupied with reading avidly, memorizing and copying the writings of the Bab, and at the time, hand-copied scriptures are the only means of publication. So Baha'i and ardent Babis would spend part of their time hand copying holy writings. Abdu'l-Bahá spends much of his time in solitary meditation. Mirza Musa, Baha'u'llah's devoted younger brother, manages the day-to-day affairs of the family with help from Abdu'l-Bahá, mature for his years. I forgot to mention that this photograph here is the Most Great House in Baghdad, one of the 2 specified places of pilgrimage by Baha'u'llah. The Most Great House in Baghdad and the House of the Bab in Shiraz. It was destroyed, but we have many, many photographs of it. The 19th of March, 1856, finally, Baha'u'llah returns from Kurdistan. This is a view of Baghdad in the 1930s. You see the river Tigris here. The fame of a renowned Dervish Muhammad spread beyond the remote mountains of Kurdistan, and news of his innate greatness and knowledge reached Baghdad, nearly 400 kilometers away. Abul Kazim Hamadani, who had been Baha'u'llah's servant and was murdered on his way from Hamadan to Baghdad, had lived long enough to say that the money he had was for Darvish Muhammad in Sulaymaniyeh. The murder is reported in an Iranian newspaper, and Abdu'l-Bahá and Mirza Musa are at the Iranian embassy when their eyes fall on this newspaper and they read the article, and they instantly realize they have just found Baha'u'llah, because no one other than Baha'u'llah could be this Darvish Muhammad. So at the insistence of Abdu'l-Bahá, who was 12 years old, and of Mirza Musa, the three Babis are dispatched to Kurdistan to beg Baha'u'llah to return. And it was the wise choice to send Iraqi Babis, not Persian Babis, who knew the country. So they went and they begged him to return. Bahiye Khanum remembers in Lady Blumfield's The Chosen Highway, the day that Baha'u'llah returned to their home. At last, as my mother, my brother, and I sat in a breathless state of expectancy, we heard a step. It was a dervish. Through the disguise, we saw the light of our beloved one's presence. Our joy cannot be described as we clung to him. I can see now my beloved mother calm and gentle, and my brother holding his father's hand fast, as though never again could he let him go out of his sight. And the lovely boy almost enfolded in the uncouth garment of the dervish disguise. I can never forget this scene, so touching and so happy. When Baha'u'llah returns to Baghdad from his exile in Kurdistan, so does the fame he acquired during his 2 years there as Darvish Muhammad. Babis and many other people come to hear his teachings. According to Abdu'l-Bahá, after his return, Baha'u'llah made strenuous efforts to educate and train the Baghdad community, reform its manners, regulate its affairs, and rehabilitate its fortunes. Soon, peace and tranquility return to the community. Abdu'l-Bahá is further quoted by Shoghi Effendi. When these fundamentals were established in the hearts of this people, everywhere they acted in such wise that in the estimation of those in authority, they became famous for the integrity of their character, the steadfastness of their hearts, the purity of their motives, the praiseworthiness of their deeds, and the excellence of their conduct. (1858) Abdu'l-Bahá in Baghdad. This is a mosque in Baghdad in the 1880s. So this is sort of what a mosque would have looked like at the time that this story takes place. By about 15 years. From the moment that Baha'u'llah returns, Abdu'l-Bahá is overwhelmed with joy and becomes his father's closest companion, and in fact, somewhat of a protector. Although Abdu'l-Bahá is still a teenager, he demonstrates astonishing wisdom and perceptiveness. He takes on the task of interviewing Baha'u'llah's numerous visitors, admitting only the genuine seekers and protecting Baha'u'llah from insincere visitors. Abdu'l-Bahá frequently answers questions and resolves problems posed by visitors of Baha'u'llah. Now 14 years old in 1858, Abdu'l-Bahá has reached the Muslim age of maturity in Middle Eastern society. He is a remarkably fine-looking young man, admired and loved for his charity and his friendliness. He becomes revered in circles beyond his father's followers. Abdu'l-Bahá regularly visits mosques in Baghdad and discusses theological matters with doctors and learned divines. Abdu'l-Bahá's favorite recreation during this time is horseback riding, and he is a very fine horseman. Now, I have to just tell you, this is one of my very favorite stories. But also, this is one of my very favorite photographs. I always wanted to know what a thorn picker looked like, and I couldn't. And Ismael Velasco managed to find in a very old book a photograph of thorn pickers in Iraq in the 1930s. And these are the people who are the subject of the story today. There is no exact date for this story, but Abdu'l-Bahá was a teenager He was probably older than 14, and he was definitely younger than 19 because he left Baghdad at the age of 19. So we can say that this story took place between 1858 and 1863, not earlier. This is a story that Abdu'l-Bahá recounts to Juliet Thompson in Thonon-les-Bains in France in August 1911. Hamadun Mulk, Abdu'l-Bahā's interpreter, hands him a booklet, like a tourist booklet of Warwick Castle in England. Abdu'l-Bahá laughs and pushes the book aside and remembers a castle of much greater importance, the hut of a thorn picker during his childhood or teenage years in Baghdad. In Baghdad and throughout the Middle East, all the way to Egypt, among the poorest of the poor are thorn pickers, these people you see here in this photograph. These individuals and families are so poor that they make a living picking thorn bushes like camel thorn that can be dried and either stored or used or sold to burn in winter for fuel. Picking thorn bushes is exceedingly painful, and only the poorest, those who no longer have any other choice, can do it. These humblest of people are whom Baha'u'lláh walks 12 miles, 19 kilometers to see, a distance that takes at least 4 hours at walking pace. And he says that he went on a very hot day, which in Baghdad means around the mid 40 degrees Celsius or 111 degrees Fahrenheit. Now you can picture in your mind this story before I tell it to you. And these are the words of Abdu'l-Bahá spoken to Juliet Thompson in 1911. What do I care about the castle of Warwick? If a good believer lived in it, that would be different. Once, when I lived in Baghdad, I was invited to the house of a poor thorn picker. In Baghdad, the heat is greater even than in Syria. And it was a very hot day. But I walked 12 miles to the thorn picker's hut. Then his wife made a cake out of some meal and burnt it in cooking it so that it was a black, hard lump. Still, that was the best reception I ever attended. This vignette is actually a little bit out of order. This would have followed the reunion with the family. This is this prayer that we all, oh my God, and renew a tranquil conscience within me, O my hope. Through the spirit of power, confirm thou me in thy cause, O my best beloved. And by the light of thy glory, reveal unto me thy path, O thou the goal of my desire. Through the power of thy transcendent might, lift me up unto the heaven of thy holiness, O source of my being. And by the breezes of thine eternity, gladden me, O thou who art my God. Let thine everlasting melodies breathe tranquility on me, O my companion. And let the riches of thine ancient countenance deliver me from all except thee, O my master. And let the tidings of the revelation of thine incorruptible essence bring me joy, O thou who art the most manifest of the manifest and the most hidden of the hidden. Upon Baha'u'llah's return from Kurdistan, he returned with very few tablets that he had revealed during his self-imposed retirement. Among them was this prayer, create in me a pure heart, which was revealed in Iraqi Kurdistan during his seclusion. Abdu'l-Bahā's first experience of this prayer in his own words, quoted in stories of Baha'u'llah by Ali Akbar Furutan. Speaking of this prayer, Abdu'l-Bahá says, When for the first time I read this tablet, I wept openly. Baha'u'llah must have had several, if not countless, opportunities to explain to people why his son was so miraculous, why Abdu'l-Bahá was so special. And we are very fortunate to have one of these stories here. This is the Al-Khadimiyya Mosque, a well-known mosque of Baghdad, as an illustration. So at one point, after Baha'u'llah had returned to Baghdad, he visited the Mosque of Kamari near the home and close to the Tigris River. And he met the Imam of the Mosque of Kamari, whose name was Abdus Salam Effendi, and whom, according to Baha'u'llah, is a man of good character and conversant with many branches of knowledge. Now, the Imam starts to regularly pay visits to Baha'u'llah, who arranges for the Imam to meet Abdu'l-Bahá on certain mornings and afternoons to discuss academic questions. One day, the Imam remarks to Baha'u'llah, "I have taught and studied over 30 years, and yet when students question me, I am obliged to refer to my books. Your accomplished child, on the other hand, is able to give explanations that have never occurred to me." Baha'u'llah explains then to the confused Imam, who is very in a state of consternation, that this has to do with Abdu'l-Bahā's mysterious faculties that Abdu'l-Bahá was endowed with by virtue of his station. And this is the explanation of Abdu'l-Bahā's powers. The essence of the most great branch is indicative of the essence of God. The most great branch effortlessly comprehends scientific matters and perceives realities which others are incapable of fathoming. Even as the Bab, who with only a few pages of practice was able to produce such exquisite handwriting, something we saw in the chronology of the Bab, and although he spent no more than a few days in school, prolific was the divine knowledge which flowed from his heart. So now Baha'u'llah is comparing the Bab and Abdu'l-Bahá and their faculties. In the same way, as soon as some aspect of knowledge comes to the attention of the most great branch, Abdu'l-Bahá, he comprehends it to a degree that no scholar, however competent, can ever match. In 1861, Baha'u'llah reveals the Kitab-i-Iqan. This is a manuscript of the first 2 pages of the Kitab-i-Iqan by an unknown calligrapher, and it is the property of the British Library. Baha'u'llah reveals the Kitab-i-Iqan in 1861 in a mixture of Persian and Arabic in 48 hours in response to 4 questions by Haji Mirza Sayyid Muhammad, one of the 4 maternal uncles of the Bab, one of the 3 maternal uncles of the Bab. The original manuscript in the handwriting of Abdu'l-Bahá at the time the master was 17 years old, with marginal additions in the hand of Baha'u'llah himself, is preserved in the archives of the Baha'i World Center in Haifa, Israel. Towards the end of the first exile in Baghdad, so towards 1862, 1863, Namik Pasha entertains Abdu'l-Bahá. This is terrible photograph of a painting of the governor of Baghdad, Namik Pasha, also known as Muhammad Najib Pasha or Guchu Mehmet Necip Pasha, or also Necip Pasha, or Najib Pasha. He has a million names. Towards the end of Baha'u'llah's exile in Baghdad, the governor of Baghdad himself, Namik Pasha, was so impressed and esteemed and venerated Baha'u'llah so much that he decided to call on Baha'u'llah to pay his personal respects. At this point, after conquering the hearts of the people, peasants and scholars, divines, rich and poor, Kurd and Sufi and Muslim and Jew and Christian and all alike, Baha'u'llah had really conquered the people of Baghdad. And of course, his enemies were very, very jealous, and he had a lot of opposition. But on one occasion, Baha'u'llah delegates Abdu'l-Bahá and Mirza Musa to visit the governor, Namik Pasha. And the governor entertains Abdu'l-Bahá and Mirza Musa with such an elaborate ceremony, with so much respect and devotion, that the deputy governor would state that, to his knowledge, no notable of the city had ever received such a courteous reception on the part of a governor of Baghdad. Between March and April 1863 came the decree for a new exile. This is not the decree that sent Baha'u'llah to a new exile. This is a decree 30 years after this event that shows that what a decree by an Ottoman Sultan looks like. You have the seal of you have seals on the bottom, seals on the top. I mean, it's a very official looking document. Once again, this is not the decree of exile of Baha'u'llah. The governor Namik Pasha requested that Baha'u'llah come and see him. Baha'u'llah refuses to go to the governor's office. Namik Pasha, unwilling to face Baha'u'llah, because he loves him so much and he doesn't want to be the one to deliver this news, sends a deputy to Baha'u'llah's house requesting a meeting at the courthouse. Baha'u'llah replies, "My mission is not with the rulers of this world, neither with their statesmen nor their officials. For what reason, therefore, should I enter their courthouse?" Bewildered, the governor thinks to invite Baha'u'llah to a mosque, because it's a house of God, in order for the farman to be read to Baha'u'llah. And Baha'u'llah consents. The farman is read to the farman is a decree. The farman is read to Baha'u'llah at the mosque, and the letter, though couched in courteous language as an invitation to Istanbul as a guest of the Ottoman Empire, provides Baha'u'llah with funds, which he will distribute to the poor and not use, and a mounted escort. Put together on the 22nd of April, 1863, the first day of Ridvan. This is the Garden of Ridvan. Accompanied by Abdul-Bahá, Mirza Mehdi, and a handful of followers, Baha'u'llah crosses the Tigris River to what we now know as the Garden of Ridvan in Baghdad. Shortly after the afternoon call to prayer, Baha'u'llah declares his station as the manifestation of God, the one promised by the Bab, him whom God shall make manifest, and announces the inauguration of the festival of Ridvan, which lasts for 12 days. On the 9th day, the waters recede, and the rest of the Holy Family, which had been preparing food and sending it to the garden, can join Baha'u'llah. That means the rest of the Holy Family. And then, on the 3rd of May, 1863, the 12th day of Ridvan, this is a map which the Garden of Ridvan is kind of in the middle, I guess. Crowds gather to bid farewell to Baha'u'llah and his family, exiled once again to Istanbul. Mounted on a red-roan stallion of the finest breed, Baha'u'llah leaves behind him a multitude of fervent admirers. Watching Baha'u'llah leave Baghdad fills the crowd with distress, and cries of Allahu Akbar ring out and again, and people throw themselves in the path of Baha'u'llah's horse. Nabil recounts, numerous were the heads which on every side bowed to the dust at the feet of his force and kissed its hoofs, and countless were those who pressed forward to embrace his stirrups. And like a king, Baha'u'llah leaves. But also like a king, Baha'u'llah will travel. This is the map of Baha'u'llah's exile from Baghdad to Constantinople. And this is, in all seriousness, a fraction of the number of stops that Baha'u'llah and the Holy Family stopped on. You see the majority of the journey was on land, from Baghdad here to Sinope here. That's about 1,600 kilometers, about 1,000 miles. And from Sinope to Istanbul was a 3-day, 900 kilometer, I think, or 700 kilometer boat trip. So now we're going to talk a little bit about this journey here from Baghdad to Constantinople. And first off, the caravan. And this is a beautiful illustration of a mid-19th century caravan. This is actually a good example of a howdah. Now, the howdahs in Baha'u'llah's caravan were not always on horses. They were mostly on mules. Mules have a much stronger back than horses. And so they carried packs, they carried boxes, they carried cartons, they carried howdahs, they carried and you see how the howdah is made out of wood and there's enough space for 2 people. And Baha'u'llah and Asiya Hanum shared a howdah for a lot of this journey. So as the Holy Family leaves Baghdad, the caravan is assembled. It consists of horses, pack mules, some loaded with baggage, and 7 howdahs, each surmounted by 4 parasols. They are accompanied by 10 soldiers and an officer. Howdahs consist of 2 wooden compartments, arched, covered with cloth, each spacious enough for 1 person. And during the journey, Baha'u'llah will ride his thoroughbred sometimes, a red roan stallion, alongside the caravan, and sometimes rest in a howdah reserved for his use and Asiya Hanum's. And always before entering a city, Baha'u'llah would exit his howdah and mount his horse. And now the journey. So this image is a 1900 image of tent. You see these tents? These are the kinds of tents that the Holy Family would have had. And that's the only reason I put this image here. These are pilgrims on the way to Mecca. They're in Palestine. But I only put this up because of these are the types of, when they weren't staying in caravanserais, they would stay in tents like these. Abdu'l-Bahá is the one who makes all the arrangements for the difficult journey across Iraq and the region of Turkey called Anatolia. Hand of the cause, Mr. Balyuzi, the eminent Baha'i historian, describes Abdu'l-Bahá's role during the 110-day journey. Abdu'l-Bahá was then a youth of 19, handsome, gracious, agile, zealous to serve, firm with the willful, generous to all. He strove hard to make the toil of a long journey less arduous for others. At night, he was among the first to reach the halting place to see to the comfort of the travelers. Wherever provisions are scarce, Baha'u'llah spends the night in search of food, knocking at doors, visiting families, asking for food for which he pays. At dawn, he rises early to set the caravan on another day's march. Then, during the whole long day, he rides by the side of his father, or by the side of the howdah of his father, in constant attendance upon Baha'u'llah. Abdu'l-Bahá himself remembers his role during the journey. I appointed myself at the head of the commissariat department, meaning the supplies. As soon as we reached the end of one stage, I would go all alone in the villages and among the wild tribes of Kurds and Arabs, and with the greatest amount of persuasion, I would make them sell me the necessary provisions for horse and men. I always thought first about the feed for the animals. Of course, without the animals, they couldn't go anywhere. So that's why Abdu'l-Bahá would focus on the animals first. And often from afternoon till midnight, I was going from one village to another, trying to find food and provision. And on my return, I was so tired, I could not stand on my feet. Then I had to supervise the division of the provision for the animals so that no one animal may take more than his share. By this time, I was so tired that I would go to sleep without eating anything. That we never really imagine Abdu'l-Bahá managing the division of feed among 70 horses. We don't, when we think of the perfect example, we don't think of that. But see how he was just, even with the animals, he was just. This is a story that's amazing. The journey is very, very arduous. Every single night they stop. And even though they have a mounted escort, items are stolen from Baha'u'llah's tent one night. Most of the stopping places in the caravan are along some sort of body of water, either the Tigris, the Euphrates, or like tributaries of those rivers. And Abdu'l-Bahá and the exiles bathe in those rivers. And although the circumstances are vastly different between the caravan of Persian pilgrims, which I'm showing you here, and the Holy Family's caravan, the tents are very close to the animals. And that's what it must have been like for the Holy Family. They would have had these tents and then the animals nearby, you know? So it's a different way of imagining Baha'u'llah. If you imagine Baha'u'llah and you only imagine him in Siat Chal, and then you only imagine him in Mazray or Bahji or in the most great prison, but that this is also something that you can imagine, is that those months and months and months, that 110 days that Baha'u'llah spent in tents on the banks of the Tigris with animals around him at all times. This is also a reality of the life of Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Bahá. Abdu'l-Bahá and his horse. I love this. I love animals. So I love any vignette that includes animals. And this vignette, this is not the horse of Abdu'l-Bahá, of course. This is a horse called Behim in Istanbul. And the photograph is taken exactly around the time the story takes place. Abdu'l-Bahā's horse is a very fine Arabian. But he is so wild and spirited that only Abdu'l-Bahá can ride him. He's a very fiery horse. But in Abdu'l-Bahā's hands, he is docile and gentle as a lamb. Abdu'l-Bahá, as we have seen, does not rest much during this long and arduous journey, owing to his many self-imposed duties, such as watching over the animals in the caravan, caring for the travelers, and ensuring the safety of Baha'u'llah at all times. He is a genius above all geniuses, and he found a way to rest that is the most amazing nap story I guarantee you are ever going to hear in your entire lives. And I know I'm building it up, but when you hear it, you're going to say, Violetta was totally right. So the way that Abdu'l-Bahá would rest is that he had a very ingenious method of catching micro amounts of micro naps, small increments of naps. And the way he would do this was that he would take his horse and he would ride as fast as the horse could go. And remember, this is a very fiery stallion. And so he would ride miles ahead of the caravan on the caravan route. And then the horse would throw himself on the ground. And just as horses do not lay down often, because horses weigh tons and they have very spindly, thin legs, and they don't often lie down. They sleep standing up mostly. They eat standing up, they sleep standing up. So this arrangement between Abdu'l-Bahá and his horse is very unusual, because the horse would throw himself on the ground after the sprint, and it would let Abdu'l-Bahá use his neck as a pillow. So Abdu'l-Bahá would rest on this warm horse's neck and take maybe, I don't know, maybe half-hour nap, 20-minute nap, just long enough for the caravan to catch up with them on walking pace, and then the horse, when the caravan approached, he would move, and he would wake up Abdu'l-Bahá, and then he would get up. Abdu'l-Bahá would get back on the horse, and then they would do the same thing again. They would sprint ahead of the caravan. The horse would throw himself down. Abdu'l-Bahá would nap on his neck. Was I right? Yes or no? Was that a great story? That's the best story of a nap, right? Yeah, I was right. Yeah, I knew. Okay, so now this is a very sweet moment in the life of the Holy Family. This is Baha'u'llah cooking for his family. One day, after a long and cold march, Abdu'l-Bahá procured bread, rice, and milk. Baha'u'llah takes these ingredients and prepares with them with his own hands for Asiya Khanum, Abdul-Bahá, Bahiya Khanum, and Mirza Mehdi. He prepares them a dish that he made up, that he used to cook for himself when he lived on Sargalu in Iraqi Kurdistan and Sulaymaniyeh. It was the only warm food that he ate. It was a sort of kind of pudding. And it depended entirely on people's generosity and what they were willing to give him as ingredients. But during the journey between Baghdad and Constantinople and Istanbul, Baha'u'llah made this for his family, a reminder of Kurdistan. And I don't think he would have done this if Kurdistan wasn't a lovely memory for him. You know, I think that Baha'u'llah was venerated in Kurdistan, and there were no Mirza Yahyas there. And when he left Kurdistan, he did tell Sheikh Sultan, the man who accompanied him, told him, these walking back to Baghdad now in nature, this is the last moment of tranquility I will ever have. So it's so hard. Anyway, this is a very cute story of a lost mule. And I have to say this every time, I love donkeys. All of you who've been with me on other chronologies, you know that when a donkey story comes up, I just love donkeys so much. And yeah, donkeys are in prophecy, you know. There is a prophecy that the Messiah would enter Jerusalem on a donkey. And Baha'u'llah rode a donkey, and Abdu'l-Bahá rode a donkey, and they lost a donkey. They lost actually 3 donkeys. They lost 3 donkeys on the journey between Baghdad and Istanbul. If you want to hear the 3 donkey stories, you have to go to the other chronology. This chronology, we're only talking about 1 donkey story. So as the caravan makes its way through a heavily wooded area, it becomes apparent that a mule or a donkey has been lost along the way. The officer accompanying the caravan says, listen, I'll give you my mule in replacement, so you don't have to go looking for it. Because, you know, in this area, when you lose something, you never, ever recover it. But the mule that was lost was carrying cases of Baha'u'llah's holy writings and other important objects. And so neither Abdu'l-Bahá nor Baha'u'llah wanted to let go of this donkey because, you know, what it was carrying was very important. And we don't know what was in it, but obviously it was extremely important. So Abdu'l-Bahá, with the permission of Baha'u'llah, set off on horseback in the dead of night with a search party. And he told his companions, what was that? Was he 17? 1863. He was 19 years old at the time. Very, very, very organized. He was always thinking like a general. And he said, relying on God, let us divide into several groups to search the various paths in the forest. Whoever finds a mule should inform the others by calling out or by lighting a fire. Abdu'l-Bahā's strategies worked gangbusters. By sunrise, the mule had been found. By noon, the elated search party rejoined the caravan, and Baha'u'llah compared Abdu'l-Bahā's actions in finding that mule to his own actions in finding another mule that was lost earlier. You have to go to the other chronology to hear that story. So now a few memories of Abdu'l-Bahá. This is a caravanserai on the route that the Baha'u'llah's caravan took. Now we don't know if they stayed in this particular caravanserai, but it's just what a caravanserai looks like. It's kind of like a motel if you have a horse or a mule or a camel. You can go into that motel, you can park your mule with the other mules or in front of your room. And usually the rooms are really bare and kind of uncomfortable. But anyway, so at each encampment, crowds would gather to see the leader of the Babis. Remembering this relentlessly strenuous journey to his secretary, Mirza Ahmad Sohrab, Abdu'l-Bahá recounts that the caravan would cover between 40 and 50 kilometers per day or by night. Often they traveled by night because it was less hot. The disadvantage of traveling by night is that you lost donkeys and you lost people because people might fall asleep or get lost. No sooner would they reach a caravanserai, so motel for animals and for caravans, Everybody would lie down and go to sleep from sheer exhaustion because they were so depleted from the day's journey that they could no longer move. Abdu'l-Bahá would not rest during these stops, but he would see to the large party of 36 horses and mules and 72 people were supplied with food and daily necessities. 2 extraordinarily devoted believers accompanied this caravan. They were, in the words of Abdu'l-Bahá, kindled in the spirit of God. They served as cooks, and they accompanied the caravan and were so devoted that they would never rest. All day, they would guide Baha'u'llah's Hawda, an arduous job. And when the caravan reached a stop, either camping or a caravanserai, they would immediately start cooking for the large party. When the meal was ready, they would serve it. Then they would serve it, and then they would have to wash the dishes and repack them, ready for the next day's journeys. And in the words of Abdu'l-Bahá, by that time in the day, they were so tired, they could have slept on even a hard boulder. During the journey to Istanbul, a famine was raging in the country. When they reached a station, Abdu'l-Bahá and Agha Abdul Ghaffar would ride on horseback from village to village and from town to town and from one Arab or Kurdish tent to another, trying to gather food, straw, and barley for the people and the animals, riding sometimes until midnight. One day, they happened on a Turk who was harvesting, and Abdu'l-Bahá tells the story in Star of the West, volume 13, number 10. So this is Abdu'l-Bahá now speaking. Seeing this large pile of straw, we thought we had come to the end of our search. I approached the Turk politely and said, "We are your guests, and one of the conditions of religious faith is to honor the newly arrived guests. I have heard that you are very liberal people, very generous, and that whenever you entertain a guest, you kill and cook for him a whole sheep. Now we desire such and such a thing, and we are ready to pay any price that you demand. We hope this is sufficiently reasonable." The Turk thought for a moment and then said, "Open your sack." Mirza Jafar opened his sack, and the Turk put in a couple of handfuls of straw. Abdu'l-Bahá was amused and said, "Oh, young friend, what can I do with this straw? We have 36 animals, and we need feed for every single one of them." Some people, seriously. Oh, man. Yep, this was the scale of the journey. 2,100 kilometers, 1,304 miles. Among the great many places the caravan stops during this journey, just to name a few, are Mosul and Kirkuk, and those are both in Iraq, with 10 stops in between. So if you look on the map here, there's a black part of the map and a red part of the map. The red part of the map is actually Turkey, and the black part of the map is Iraq. Towards the border between Iraq and Turkey, you see Mosul, and then Erbil, and then Kirkuk. This Erbil is the only stop we know of, but the caravan stopped 10 times between Kirkuk and Mosul, not once in Erbil. It stopped 10 times. So an average of 17 kilometers between each stop. That particular scale of the journey would have been really arduous, because when the terrain was good, the caravan could cover 40 kilometers. But the Holy Family would have had to camp between 30 and 100 times during this journey. And then finally, they get to a city called Harput, and they get a rest in Harput. Harput is a nice experience for them, because the animals by this stage of the ordeal had become skinny, and they were walking with difficulty. And so in Harput, the acting governor, Izzat Pasha, calls on Baha'u'llah and brings with him the best gift ever: 10 carloads of rice, 10 sacks of barley, 10 sheep, several baskets of rice, several bags of sugar, many pounds of butter, and other things. I mean, Can you imagine what a wonderful gift this is for these exhausted exiles? After the ordeal of the journey and how difficult it had been to obtain anything from the farmers along the road, especially because in some places there were famines in the region, so they couldn't get any food. So these gifts seemed to Abdu'l-Bahá as if they had been sent from God. And they were gladly accepted. And Abdu'l-Bahá in Harput was, so let's see, we're in Harput, where is Harput in the map? Harput is, you see, it's a like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stops into the red part of the map, into Turkey, Harput. So by this point, that they're so anyway, when Abdu'l-Bahá arrives in Harput, he sleeps 2 days and 2 nights. That's how exhausted he was. Abdu'l-Bahá slept for 2 full days and nights. The Holy Family rested in Harput for a week and then continued on to Samsun, which is like all through Anatolia, all the way to the Black Sea. And this is this was Harput. This was a photograph of Harput. And this is a photograph of Samsun. Baha'u'lláh and the Holy Family arrive in the port city of Samsun on the shores of the Black Sea after a grueling 1,600-kilometer overland journey from Baghdad. In Samsun, they board a steamship and complete the remaining roughly 800 kilometers of their journey over 2 days and a half. And tomorrow, we will pick up where we left off and begin the story with Baha'u'llah's second exile in Constantinople, Istanbul. Thank you very much for today. It was wonderful to see you all. And we're going to stop the recording now. And then we're going to have a discussion.